Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin. Welcome. We're glad you're here. Apparently, Joe Biden is going to run his presidential campaign not just from his basement, but on the issue of freedom. He's tested that out. His staff has tested that out. You know, freedom versus tyranny. Freedom versus MAGA Republicans, extreme, radical MAGA Republicans. Joe Biden stands for freedom. Actually, Joe Biden stands for totalitarianism. There's not a damn thing he's done as president to promote freedom. In fact, I can't think of anything that man did as vice president or in the Senate for 412 years to promote freedom. As a matter of fact, Joe Biden is the last of the segregationists, the old segregationists. He likes to pretend he was part of the civil rights movement. He was part of the anti-civil rights movement. As soon as he stepped foot in the U.S. Senate, he befriended the most racist segregationists in the U.S. Senate, and they took him under his wing. How do we know this? Because the documents show us, the speeches and the votes show us. And what did he do? He opposed every attempt at integrating public schools, particularly in the inner cities, including in Wilmington. In fact, he opposed every attempt at integrating cities, period. Joe Biden was a full-throated segregationist and racist. And so he's always remaking himself into something that he's not, of course. So not only wasn't he a civil rights activist, he was also a plagiarist. That's how he got through law school. And, of course, he was a plagiarist even when he ran for president twice before, stealing the words of Robert F. Kennedy and Neil Kinnock and others, lying about his scholarship and his grades, and none of that has changed. The man lies continuously. So he's going to run on freedom, you see. Well, let's take a look at his record. First of all, how many unscripted press conferences has the great freedom leader had? Almost none. Why? Because in addition to unscripted press conferences, he won't allow an unscripted neurological examination from a truly objective, impartial, top-level doctor to take a look at what's going on up there. Not a lot, apparently. And you know what? We, the American people, have a right to demand of him, the First Lady, the media, and the Democrat Party to know, before there's a single vote cast in the Democrat primaries, certainly in the general election, what the mental health is of Joe Biden. It's not a joke. It's not a cliche. It's a reality. We have a 25th Amendment there. We shouldn't have to wait to figure out how to trigger the 25th Amendment to figure out if Joe Biden's capable of being president of the United States. That man has his finger right next to the nuclear button. We have a right to know as the American people. I thought he believed in freedom. Now let's look at his freedom agenda and policies. Disinformation board, Twitter, FBI, DHS censorship, replacing equality with equity. Very Marxist of him. Serial noncompliance with the Constitution. He rules by executive orders. War on energy independence. It doesn't sound very free to me. Banning air conditioning units, gas stoves, combustion engines, fossil fuels. Destroying women's sports. So far, does that sound very free to you? Turning our borders over to mass murdering drug cartels. Overseeing the sex trade, enslavement of children, and crimes on our borders. Millions of illegal aliens flooding our towns and cities, our schools and our hospitals. Tons of fentanyl, other drugs, illegal weapons. So much for gun control coming across our border. Proposing to steal people's wealth, a wealth tax? Really? Venezuela must be very proud. We're on the independence of the Supreme Court and individual justices like we've never seen before. War on the pro-life community. War on parents. Promotion of partial birth abortion right before birth. Joe Biden believes it's not a baby, it's a choice. Investigations of political opponents like former President Trump, who also happens to be the leading Republican candidate to run against him. That's right, sexualizing children, condoning sex changes without parental consent. You know what that sounds like to me? Sick. Perversion. Talks about book bannings by DeSantis and others in our schools. Joe, they're talking about taking pornography out of our schools. You support that? Apparently he doesn't. Teaching CRT, that is racism, to our children. That doesn't sound very free to me. Creating mountains of debt with massive borrowing and spending imposed on us, the next generation, future generations yet born. They won't be free. Pushing our nation into a debt crisis because he refuses to even negotiate with his ridiculous $7 trillion budget. He's created massive inflation on food, gas, everything. He believes in eliminating the single-family homes in the suburbs through HUD. He's expanded the IRS by 87,000 agents. That's to go after you. He opposes school choice at the behest of the thuggish teachers' unions. That's what Joe Biden believes freedom is. What else? Cato and the Fraser Institute look at Human Freedom Index in 2022. They look at the rule of law. They look at religion. They look at relationships, size of government, and so forth. And you know what they found? The United States has dropped seven nations. We're 23rd among nations now. 23rd among nations. Who's number one? Well, they say Switzerland, then New Zealand, Estonia, Denmark, Ireland, Sweden, Iceland, Finland, Netherlands. Tiny, tiny little countries. We used to be number one. Joe Biden's killing us. Heritage Foundation, economic freedom. We've dropped there too. Rank in the world, 25th. United States economic freedom score is 70.6. It scores 1.5 points lower than last year. Wow. Joe really believes in freedom, doesn't he? But there's even more. We call this the Constitution of the United States. Joe put his left hand on his Bible, his right hand in the air, and he swore to uphold it and to enforce our laws. Doing a very, very bad job, Joe. Let's take a look. Article 1, Section 1, right there, the first sentence. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. Plain English. Even Joe should be able to comprehend that. So he comes in office. The first couple of days in office, he signs as many executive orders as Franklin Roosevelt, and since then, probably more. What else? Oh, look at this. We have Article 1, Section 8. To borrow money on the credit of the United States, that's Congress, not the executive, to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. To borrow money on the credit of the United States. So when Joe Biden issues an executive order that's $1 trillion in your money to redistribute to wealthier Americans to pay off their student loans, that violates the Constitution. Every executive order that he has signed that has a huge effect on the economic situation in this country is supposed to go through Congress, particularly if it involves money. Joe has ignored it left and right. To establish a uniform rule of naturalization, that's immigration. What has he done on immigration? Well, he's ignored every single law on the books, every single one. Article 2, Section 3, this involves the president himself. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. They even say that when he's sworn in. I shall take care that the laws of the United States are faithfully executed, whether he likes them or not. Has he done that? I just said he hasn't. So that's 4 provisions of the United States Constitution that Joe Biden has violated. What else? He doesn't like the Bill of Rights. No, this former racist segregationist, plagiarist, he does not like the Bill of Rights. Here's the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Joe Biden, with his Democrats in Congress, have done everything they can to kneecap religious organizations and faiths with their secularist left-wing agenda. Abridging the freedom of speech. Oh, we know that he hates free speech. His FBI and DHS have worked with Twitter and the other internet organizations, and of course, he set up that board. Disinformation. In other words, if you disagree with the government. Of course, the Second Amendment, the part of the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be abridged. Joe has signed executive orders to try and abridge it. He goes on about attacking your right to bear arms. No other country in the world has it. Exactly. And no other country in the world has a Bill of Rights or a First Amendment either. What about the Fourth Amendment? The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Did not the Inspector General of the Department of Justice testify a few days back that there were 1 million cases of the FBI doing unreasonable searches? 1 million, we're rounding down. What about the Fifth Amendment, the part that says you're not to be deprived of the life, liberty, or property without due process of law? What's this wealth tax and these other things? They come up with all these regulations to steal your property, and I've only just begun. The Constitution of the United States is what protects us from government. It's what keeps government in its proper limited lane. And Joe Biden and the Democrats are endlessly attacking the framers, attacking our foundational principles. They seek to destroy the Constitution. Anything that's in the way, they want to destroy, burn down, whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's the filibuster rule, whether it's our voting system, whether it's the borders, and so forth and so on. So Joe Biden's going to run as the freedom president? No. He should run as the oldest living former racist segregationist from the 1970s, who opposed integration then and opposes it today. That's right. He embraces critical race theory, which wants to resegregate America, black and white.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.